Imagine this. You're sitting in a dimly lit cafe, the kind where the air smells like freshly ground coffee and the faint hum of conversation wraps around you like a warm blanket. Across from you sits someone you once loved, someone who shattered your heart into a million pieces. They're crying now, their voice trembling as they beg for another chance. The words spill out of their mouth like a desperate plea. I was wrong. I need you back. But here's the thing, you've moved on. Or at least, you thought you had. The question is, what do you do? Do you give them another shot, knowing they might break you all over again? Or do you walk away, leaving them in the dust of their own regret? This is the story of the man who threw her away, is now on his knees, begging for another chance. A tale of love, betrayal, and the ultimate test of forgiveness. And trust me, by the end of this video, you'll be asking yourself, what would I do in her shoes? Let's be real for a second. We've all been there, haven't we? That moment when someone you trusted, someone you gave your heart to, turns around and throws it away like it meant nothing. Maybe it was a breakup that came out of nowhere, or maybe it was a slow, painful unraveling of a relationship you thought would last forever. Whatever it was, the pain sticks with you. It lingers in the back of your mind, popping up at the most inconvenient times, like when you're scrolling through old photos or driving past that one spot where you shared your first kiss. And just when you think you've finally moved on, life has a funny way of bringing that person back into your life, forcing you to confront all those emotions you thought you'd buried. That's exactly what happened to Emily, the woman at the center of this story. And let me tell you, her journey is one you won't want to miss. Emily was the kind of woman who had it all together, or at least, that's what everyone thought. She had a successful career, a close-knit group of friends, and a smile that could light up a room. But beneath that polished exterior was a woman who had been deeply hurt. Her ex, Daniel, had walked out on her 2 years ago, leaving her to pick up the pieces of a life they'd built together. At the time, he'd said it was for the best. "We're just not right for each other," he told her, his voice cold and detached. And just like that, he was gone. Emily spent months trying to make sense of what had happened, replaying their last conversation over and over in her head, searching for answers that never came. Eventually, she forced herself to move on, throwing herself into her work and swearing off love for good. That is, until Daniel showed up at her doorstep one rainy evening, looking like a shadow of the man she once knew. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why would she even consider giving him another chance? He had his shot, and he blew it. And you're not wrong. But here's the thing, love is messy. It's complicated. It doesn't follow a neat little script where the bad guy gets what he deserves and the heroine rides off into the sunset. Real life is full of gray areas, and Emily found herself standing right in the middle of one. Daniel wasn't just asking for forgiveness, he was begging for it. He'd spent the last 2 years realizing what he'd lost, and now he was determined to win her back. But was it too little? Too late? That's the question Emily had to answer. And as you watch this story unfold, you'll find yourself asking the same thing. What would you do if the person who broke your heart came crawling back? Would you give them another chance, or would you close the door on them for good? As we dive deeper into Emily and Daniel's story, you'll meet the key players who shaped their journey. There's Sarah, Emily's best friend and voice of reason, who's been by her side through every high and low. Then there's Mark, Daniel's older brother, who's seen firsthand the toll his brother's mistakes have taken on everyone around him. And of course, there's Emily's mom, a woman who's been through her own share of heartbreak and has some tough love advice to share. Each of these characters brings something unique to the table, adding layers of complexity to a story that's already brimming with emotion. But at its core, this is a story about second chances and whether or not they're worth the risk. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, this sounds like just another love story. But trust me, it's so much more than that. This is a story about resilience, about picking yourself up after you've been knocked down and finding the strength to keep going. It's about the power of forgiveness, not just forgiving others, but forgiving yourself. And most importantly, it's about realizing that sometimes the person who hurt you the most can also be the one who helps you heal. But don't worry, I'm not going to spoil the ending for you. You'll have to keep watching to find out what happens. All I'll say is this: by the time you reach the final scene, you'll be on the edge of your seat, wondering how it's all going to play out. So grab a cup of coffee, get comfortable, and let's dive into this emotional roller coaster of a story. Whether you're here because you've been through something similar or you're just curious to see how it all unfolds, I promise you this: by the end of this video, you'll have the answers you've been searching for. And who knows? You might even walk away with a new perspective on love, forgiveness, and the power of second chances. But before we get to the heart of the story, let me ask you this: if you were in Emily's shoes, what would you do? Would you open the door and let Daniel back into your life, or would you tell him to hit the road? Think about it as we dive into the first chapter of the man who threw her away is now on his knees begging for another chance. And trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Emily's life had been a whirlwind of emotions ever since Daniel walked out that door 2 years ago. At first, she tried to convince herself that she was better off without him. She threw herself into her work, taking on extra projects and staying late at the office just to keep her mind occupied. Nights were the hardest. That's when the silence would creep in, and the memories would come flooding back: the way he used to laugh at her terrible jokes, the way his hand felt in hers, the way he'd look at her like she was the only person in the room. But as time went on, the sharp edges of her pain began to dull. She started going out with friends again, even dipping her toes into the dating pool, though no one ever quite measured up to Daniel. And then, just when she thought she'd finally turned the corner, he showed up at her door, drenched from the rain and looking like he hadn't slept in weeks. "I need to talk to you," he'd said, his voice barely above a whisper. And just like that, the walls she'd spent so long building around her heart began to crack. Daniel's reappearance wasn't just a shock to Emily. It sent ripples through their entire circle of friends and family. Sarah, Emily's best friend since college, was the first to weigh in. "You're not seriously considering taking him back, are you?" she'd asked, her tone a mix of disbelief and concern. Sarah had been there through the worst of it: the nights Emily spent crying on her couch, the days she couldn't bring herself to get out of bed. She'd seen the damage Daniel had done, and she wasn't about to let Emily forget it. But even Sarah had to admit that there was something different about Daniel this time. He wasn't the confident, self-assured man who'd walked out on Emily 2 years ago. This version of Daniel was broken, humbled, and desperate. "People can change," he'd told Emily during one of their late-night conversations. "I've changed, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving it to you if you'll let me." But Daniel's return wasn't just about winning Emily back. It was also about confronting the mistakes he'd made and the people he'd hurt along the way. His older brother, Mark, had always been his rock, the one person who'd stood by him no matter what. But even Mark had his limits. "You broke her, Daniel," Mark had said during a heated argument. "You don't get to just waltz back into her life and expect everything to be okay." Mark had his own reasons for being protective of Emily. He'd watched her pick up the pieces of her life after Daniel left, and he'd seen the strength it took for her to rebuild herself from the ground up. He wasn't about to let his brother undo all of that hard work. But even Mark couldn't deny that there was something different about Daniel this time. He wasn't just asking for forgiveness, he was actively trying to make amends. He'd started therapy, quit his high-stress job, and even reached out to old friends he'd alienated over the years. It was as if he was trying to rebuild himself from the inside out, piece by piece. As Emily grappled with whether or not to give Daniel another chance. She found herself drawn into a web of emotions she thought she'd buried long ago. There were moments when she felt a flicker of the old connection they'd shared, moments when she could almost convince herself that they could start over. But then the doubts would creep in, whispering in her ear that she was setting herself up for another heartbreak. What if he leaves again? She'd asked Sarah during one of their late-night talks. What if I let him back in and he destroys me all over again? Sarah didn't have an answer, and neither did Emily. All she knew was that she couldn't keep living in this limo, torn between the past and the possibility of a future she wasn't sure she wanted. Meanwhile, Daniel was facing his own set of challenges. Rebuilding trust wasn't easy, especially when the person you hurt the most is the one you're trying to win back. He'd started writing letters to Emily, pouring his heart out on paper in a way he'd never been able to do in person. He'd tell her about the moments he'd regretted the most, the times he'd taken her for granted, the fights he'd started over nothing, the way he'd let his own insecurities sabotage their relationship. He'd also started volunteering at a local shelter, something he'd never done before but found surprisingly therapeutic. "It's not about trying to prove I'm a good person," he'd told Mark during one of their heart-to-hearts. "It's about trying to become one." But just when it seemed like things might be heading in a positive direction, a new complication arose. Emily's mom, who'd always been a voice of reason in her life, dropped a bombshell during one of their weekly phone calls. "I never told you this," she'd said, her voice trembling, "but your father and I went through something similar before you were born." Emily was stunned. Her parents had always seemed like the picture of marital bliss, but now her mom was revealing a side of their relationship she'd never known existed. "He left me for a while," her mom continued, "and when he came back, I didn't know if I could trust him again. But we worked through it, and it made us stronger in the end." Emily didn't know what to do with this information. On one hand, it gave her hope that maybe she and Daniel could find their way back to each other. On the other hand, it made her question everything she thought she knew about love and forgiveness. As the days turned into weeks, the tension between Emily and Daniel continued to build. There were moments of tenderness, like when he showed up at her door with her favorite coffee, just because. But there were also moments of frustration, like when he'd push her to talk about things she wasn't ready to face. "I just need to know if there's a chance for us," he'd said during one particularly emotional conversation. Emily had looked at him, her heart torn in two, and said the words she'd been dreading, "I don't know." It was the truth, but it didn't make it any easier to say. And as she stood there, watching the hope flicker in Daniel's eyes, she couldn't help but wonder if she was making the biggest mistake of her life, or if she was on the verge of something truly extraordinary. But just when it seemed like the story couldn't get any more complicated, a new twist emerged. Emily received a letter in the mail, addressed to her in handwriting she didn't recognize. Inside was a single sentence: "You deserve to know the truth about Daniel." There was no signature, no return address, just those 7 words that sent a chill down her spine. Who had sent it? And what truth were they referring to? Emily's mind raced with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Was there something Daniel hadn't told her? Something he was hiding? Or was this just someone trying to stir up trouble? She didn't know, but one thing was certain: the stakes had just gotten a whole lot higher. And as she stood there, holding the letter in her trembling hands, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't even begin to imagine. Emily's hands trembled as she stared at the mysterious letter, the words "You deserve to know the truth about Daniel" burning into her mind like a brand. Her first instinct was to confront him, to demand answers, but something held her back. What if this was just a cruel joke? What if someone was trying to sabotage whatever fragile connection she and Daniel were rebuilding? She couldn't shake the feeling that this letter was a Pandora's box, and once she opened it, there would be no going back. For days, she carried the letter with her, tucked into her bag, its presence a constant reminder that there were secrets lurking beneath the surface of her life. She tried to focus on work, on her friends, on anything that would distract her from the gnawing uncertainty. But the letter was always there, whispering to her in the quiet moments when her guard was down. Meanwhile, Daniel was doing everything in his power to prove he was a changed man. He'd started showing up at Emily's favorite cafe every morning, not to pressure her but simply to be there, to remind her that he was serious about making amends. He'd even started attending therapy sessions twice a week, something he'd once scoffed at as unnecessary. "I'm not just doing this for you," he'd told her during one of their rare, honest conversations. "I'm doing it for me too. I need to figure out why I keep sabotaging the things that matter most." Emily wanted to believe him, but the letter had planted a seed of doubt in her mind, and it was growing with every passing day. She found herself scrutinizing his every word, every gesture, searching for signs that he was hiding something. Was he being sincere, or was this all just an act? She didn't know, and the not knowing was driving her crazy. The tension between them reached a boiling point one evening when Daniel, showed up at her apartment unannounced. He looked disheveled, his eyes bloodshot, as if he hadn't slept in days. "We need to talk," he said, his voice urgent. Emily's heart raced as she let him in, her mind spinning with possibilities. Was he finally going to come clean about whatever the letter was hinting at? Or was this about something else entirely? They sat across from each other in her living room, the air thick with unspoken words. "I know things have been complicated," Daniel began, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "But I need you to know that I'm all in. I'm not going anywhere this time." Emily wanted to believe him, but the letter was like a shadow hanging over them, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. "What are you telling me, Daniel?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her, his expression a mix of confusion and fear. "What do you mean?" he asked, but before she could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "We need to talk." "Now." Sarah's text was cryptic, but Emily could tell from the tone that it was serious. She excused herself, promising Daniel they'd finish the conversation later, and rushed to meet Sarah at their usual spot, a cozy little diner on the edge of town. When she arrived, Sarah was already there, her face pale and her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of coffee. "What's going on?" Emily asked as she slid into the booth across from her. Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as if she was afraid someone might overhear. "I didn't want to tell you this," she began, her voice trembling, "but I think you need to know. Daniel, he's been keeping something from you." Emily's heart sank. "What do you mean?" she asked, though a part of her already knew the answer. Sarah took a deep breath and dropped the bombshell. "He wasn't alone when he left you. There was someone else." The words hit Emily like a punch to the gut. She felt the room spin around her, the sounds of the diner fading into a distant hum. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Sarah reached across the table and took her hand. "I didn't want to believe it either," she said, "but I saw them together. It was right after he left you. I didn't say anything because I thought it was just a fling, something he'd regret and move on from. But now, I don't know, I think it's more than that." Emily's mind raced as she tried to process what Sarah was telling her. All this time, she'd thought Daniel had left because he'd fallen out of love with her. But what if it wasn't that simple? What if there had been someone else all along? The thought made her sick to her stomach, but it also explained so much: the way he'd been so cold and distant in those final weeks, the way he'd refused to give her a straight answer when she'd begged him to stay. But just when Emily thought she had the full picture, another twist emerged. As she was leaving the diner, her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from an unknown number. It was a photo, grainy and slightly out of focus, but unmistakable. It was Daniel, standing outside a small house Emily didn't recognize, his arm around a woman she'd never seen before. The caption read, "The truth is closer than you think." Emily's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the photo, her mind racing with questions. Who was this woman? And what did she have to do with Daniel? She didn't know, but one thing was clear: the letter, Sarah's revelation, and now this photo were all pieces of a puzzle she couldn't ignore. And as she stood there, clutching her phone like a lifeline, she realized that the answers she'd been searching for were closer than she'd ever imagined, but they might also destroy everything she thought she knew about the man she'd once loved. The stakes had never been higher, and the tension was palpable as Emily found herself standing at a crossroads. Should she confront Daniel with what she knew, risking the fragile connection they'd started to rebuild? Or should she dig deeper, uncovering the truth no matter how painful it might be? The choice was hers, but one thing was certain: the story was far from over, and the next chapter would change everything. As she walked back to her apartment, the weight of the unknown pressing down on her, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to take a leap into the unknown. And as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, she realized that the truth might be more complicated and more devastating than she'd ever imagined. Emily stood outside her apartment, the photo of Daniel and the mysterious woman burning a hole in her pocket. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, betrayal, confusion, and a lingering, stubborn hope that maybe, just maybe, there was an explanation for all of this. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come, and pushed open the door. Daniel was still there, sitting on her couch, his head in his hands. He looked up as she entered, his eyes red and swollen, as if he'd been crying. "Emily," he began, his voice cracking, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Don't," she said, her voice trembling. "Just don't." She pulled out her phone and showed him the photo, watching as his face went pale. "Who is she, Daniel?" she demanded, her voice rising. "And don't you dare lie to me." For a moment, Daniel just stared at the photo, his expression unreadable. Then, with a heavy sigh, he began to speak. "Her name is Claire," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She's my sister." Emily blinked, stunned. "Your sister?" she repeated, her mind struggling to process the information. Daniel nodded, his eyes filled with guilt and regret. "I know I should have told you about her," he said, "but it's complicated. Claire and I haven't spoken in years. She's been struggling with addiction, and I didn't know how to help her. When I left you, it wasn't because of her, but she was part of the reason. I was so caught up in my own problems and trying to fix things with her that I lost sight of what really mattered. And by the time I realized what I'd done, it was too late." Emily felt a wave of emotions crash over her relief. Anger, sadness, and a strange sense of empathy. She'd always known Daniel had a complicated relationship with his family, but she'd never imagined it was this bad. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why did you let me think the worst?" Daniel looked down, unable to meet her gaze. "I was ashamed," he admitted. "I didn't want you to see how messed up my life was. I thought if I could just fix things on my own, I could come back to you and everything would be okay. But I was wrong. I hurt you, and I'll never forgive myself for that." As the truth began to sink in, Emily felt the weight of the past 2 years pressing down on her. All the pain, the heartbreak, the sleepless nights, it all came rushing back, but this time, it was mixed with a strange sense of clarity. Daniel hadn't left her for someone else. He'd left because he was lost, because he didn't know how to ask for help. And while that didn't excuse what he'd done, it did change the way she saw him. He wasn't the villain she'd made him out to be. He was just a flawed, broken man trying to find his way. But that didn't mean she had to forgive him. Not yet, anyway. The next few days were a blur of emotions and difficult conversations. Emily reached out to Claire, wanting to understand the full story, and what she learned only deepened her empathy for Daniel. Claire had been through abusive relationships, addiction, homelessness, and Daniel had been trying to help her get back on her feet. It wasn't an excuse for the way he'd treated Emily, but it did explain a lot. And as she listened to Claire's story, Emily realized that forgiveness wasn't just about letting go of the past. It was about understanding, about seeing the humanity in the people who'd hurt us. In the end, Emily made a decision, one that surprised even herself. She didn't take Daniel back, not right away. There was too much pain, too much history between them to just pick up where they'd left off. But she didn't close the door on him either. Instead, she told him they needed to start over, to rebuild their relationship from the ground up. "I can't promise you anything," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "But if you're serious about changing, about being the man I know you can be, then I'm willing to try. But it's going to take time. And trust. And a lot of hard work." Daniel nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude and determination. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said, his voice firm. "I'll spend the rest of my life proving to you that I'm worth it." And as Emily looked at him, she felt a flicker of hope, not just for their relationship, but for herself. She'd been through hell, but she'd come out stronger on the other side. And whether or not things worked out with Daniel, she knew she'd be okay. Because she'd learned something invaluable through all of this, that forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past. It's about finding the strength to move forward, even when it hurts. The story of Emily and Daniel is one of love, loss, and the power of second chances. It's a reminder that life is messy, that people are flawed, and that sometimes the hardest thing to do is also the most important, to forgive. But forgiveness isn't just about letting go of the past, it's about opening yourself up to the possibility of a better future. And as Emily stood there looking into Daniel's eyes, she realized that maybe, just maybe, their story wasn't over yet. Maybe it was just beginning. And as the camera fades out, leaving them standing there, facing an uncertain but hopeful future, one thing is clear: love is never easy, but it's always worth fighting for.